Hi, this is your professor, Pat Hanahoe-Dosch again. I'm here today to talk to you about short stories. Now, a couple of things are very important. I've given you another little presentation in a video about structure of a story, and that's very important to look at. It's really important to remember that all stories must have conflict. There must be tension. There must be some sort of conflict between the protagonist and the antagonist. The protagonist is the main character, and the antagonist is the character or even a force of some kind that creates the conflict. And that conflict could be anything. It could be internal, although that's much harder to pull off, or it could be some sort of external conflict between people, uh, government versus person, whatever. There are many types of conflict. But you have to have some kind of conflict. Without conflict, there's no story. Nobody just wants to read a happily ever after anything. What your audience is going to be interested in is the conflict and how that conflict gets resolved. Now, to be literary fiction, there needs to be some sort of epiphany and theme involved. But pure entertainment fiction doesn't necessarily have to have that, but there still has to be conflict and resolution. So you need a plot which encompasses action and a sort of rising action that then comes to a peak in the climax and then falls off into some sort of resolution. That's the minimum you have to have. And you have to have at least two characters, a protagonist and antagonist. Short stories don't generally have a lot more than that. There may be one or two minor characters. Sometimes they're the kind of characters that just move the storyline along. They're just flat characters. Or sometimes they're minor characters that act maybe as a foil for another character. In other words, the contrast between them illustrates something about the main character, and so on. But you need two characters, two main characters, the protagonist and antagonist, unless the antagonist is some sort of outside force, which again is also harder to pull off. Um, you also need to have language. You need to use language effectively. You want to really think about how you word things. Figurative language can be very helpful. Prose, especially fiction, doesn't necessarily it isn't mired in the way that poetry is, but it does need it sometimes to help with things. And you need enough description that we can see where you are. We need the setting clarified, often through description or sometimes clues in the story. And everything in the story has to follow by the rules you establish in that setting. So if you make up a world, whether it's fantasy, sci-fi, whatever, then everything within that story has to follow the rules of that world. It has to make sense in terms of that world. If it's in the real world, it has to make sense in terms of the real world. But your setting has to be clear, both in time and place, and you should really think about why you're setting your story in that time and place. What does it do for you? What does it do for the characters? How does it propel the story forward? Also think about how you're dividing your story into scenes. Scenes are sections of the story where something new happens, a new event's happening. And scenes have rising action and falling off tension and so on, and maybe even their own conflicts sometimes. So that's important to consider because scenes are the building blocks of a story too. You need some exposition, narration, telling us what's happening, but keep that at a minimum. You want your story to be propelled forward by action and dialogue, and so that we see and hear what's happening. Some narration is always important, but the focus should be on action and dialogue to really make it move fast. The more narration and exposition you have, the slower the story becomes. And sometimes that's good, sometimes it's not. So you have to think about those things. Think about your dialogue. Your dialogue is crucial. If your dialogue is very stilted or too formal or too awkward or doesn't sound like what these characters should sound like, then it's going to slow the whole story down and nobody's going to want to read it. So your dialogue has to sound natural. And sometimes that's a matter of listening to people around you. You really have to listen to people. And if you don't know how someone from New Jersey really sounds, you only know about stereotypes, then you probably don't want to set your character in New Jersey because being from New Jersey, I can tell you we don't generally talk in those same stereotypes. So we have unique characteristics to our speech. So you have to really think about that. Think about how people sound. People generally talk in contractions. We don't we don't lay out our words completely the way you might do in a formal speech. We speak in contractions. We also speak in idioms generally. We speak in sometimes partial sentences and so on. So you have to think about natural speech. How do you make this sound natural? And then you have to format it correctly so we can follow it. And I've given you lots of information in the learning module on how to do that. Actually, in a number of learning modules on how to do that. Please make sure you pay attention to that. If you don't format your dialogue correctly, it becomes very difficult to follow and confusing and just annoying. So that's important. Sorry, I'm trying to see what else I wrote down here that I want you to do. And last but not least, think about the question, what if? Especially if you're struggling and trying to find a story. The best way to find it is to think, what if? You're sitting there thinking, what if something happened here? What if that rose could talk? What if my cat could talk? What if that house over there suddenly collapsed inside of itself? What if there really is a ghost in this house? What if questions help you to find ideas for your stories, and sometimes also to find ideas for what can happen in the story. Sometimes we start with a character, and sometimes we start with a place, sometimes we start with the action, but we always have to figure out then, where's the story going to go? And so the question, what if, can help you along with that, help you figure that out. Your characters need to be fleshed out. The main characters, anyway, not necessarily minor characters, but your main character, especially the protagonist, needs to be a fully rounded person. And we need to understand what this person looks like, although don't get too bogged down in details. We need the more important details, but we don't need to know everything about what this person looks like. We need to know about the important details that affect what this person is doing and why. Does this person feel insecure because he or she is overweight? Or does the person feel overly confident and arrogant because he or she is gorgeous? I mean, those are the important things you need to dwell on. We don't need to know every detail of what the person looks like. But we need to know a lot about the person's character, the personality. And that will evolve through the story, but most importantly, you need to know that. You need to know everything about this character before you start writing that story. What is the character's weakness? What are the main weaknesses? What are the strengths of this character? What are the desires? What's motivating the character? What are the character's fears and insecurities? Are those motivating the character? What's the history of this character? What has this character done that he or she's ashamed of? And so on. Those kinds of questions allow you to understand the character well enough to write about him or her or it. And you need to know them. You need to know that character really well before you even start writing. Actually, you'll find out a lot more about the character as you write, but that only happens if that character is real to you when you begin writing. So have fun. Writing fiction is just a lot of fun. I mean, it's hard work too, but it's a lot of fun. You are now entering into the area of the gods. You're creating something. You're creating something out of nothing. You're creating worlds and people and having them do things and pulling their strings. So have fun doing it. Use your imagination. Write about things that you daydream about. If you daydream about being a superhero, make your character that superhero. That's what stories are made out of. Enjoy it, have fun, and if you have any questions or problems, make sure you contact me. That's what I'm here for. Bye.